guys, welcome to the Bemis Palmer Museum. We are located at 520 North Grant Avenue in York, Nebraska, and today I'm going to show you our America at War exhibit. Okay, so starting off with our timeline, these are all the wars that America has been involved with over time, and the items that we're going to be talking about today range from the Civil War to the Korean War.
This war took place from 1861 to 1865. We have a lot of items relating to it, several of which are linked to the Grand Army of the Republic. For those that don't know, the Grand Army of the Republic, or GAR, was the veterans organization for Union soldiers. When someone returned from the war, sometimes it was hard for them to talk about their experience, but it could be easier when talking to someone who also went through it. The GAR had several posts all around the country, including in York, and that one was named after Robert Anderson. The GAR held many reunions, encampments, parades, and concerts. They are also responsible for Memorial Day. Though it was originally called Decoration Day, they would go to cemeteries to clean and decorate Union soldiers' graves. This then turned into any military grave and onto all graves. The symbol for their organization is the upside-down star hanging from the flag. This symbol can actually be seen in a nearby church's stained glass windows. Some items in our GAR section are a collection of letters and journal entries from soldiers during the war, photos of GAR members with some important paperwork, a framed photo of York's Post's charter as well as one of its leaders over the years, plus a collection of medals and ribbons. There is also a large photograph of Juliet Blanchard, surrounded by medals and ribbons she earned during her time in the war as a nurse, and a few items pertaining to our founder's first husband. Robert Irvin Cutler was born in 1846 in Plymouth, Ohio. He mustered into Company H of the 163rd Ohio Infantry on May 18, 1864, at the age of 18, and served 100 days in the Union Army. Following the war, Cutler relocated to Nebraska and married Anna Gray Bemis in 1920. He taught science and authored textbooks. They stayed married until his death on December 23, 1935. Cutler was a member of the GAR and was appointed aide-de-camp in 1920. Here you'll see his GAR certificates, ritual book, and discharge papers. Moving on to other items from the Civil War, here we have a newspaper print. Newspaper was limited at the time due to rations, and this was, interestingly enough, printed on wallpaper, which you can see through the reverse of the display. In this glass case, you'll see several Civil War artifacts, including powder horns, medical cases, stirrups, bullets, an officer's sash, and on the bottom is a Confederate sword crossed with one from the Union. This Confederate sword belonged to J.B. Reed, a captain from Kentucky. After the war, he married and relocated to York as part of the Homestead Act. Another cool item is this drum played at the Battle of Gettysburg. It belonged to John Jason Brewer, a captain in the Union Army. He passed the item on to his family, and his grandson played it in his high school band in Alma, Nebraska in the early 1900s. This photo of a boy holding a flag was hung in two brothers' homes. After being orphaned by their parents, William and R.J. Bullock joined the Union Army. Following the war, they moved to Nebraska. Both brothers were members of the GAR and are buried in Greenwood Cemetery here in York. James Birdseye McPherson was unfortunately killed in battle by a unit run by his West Point classmate and childhood friend, John Bell Hood. Hood was so overcome with grief that he actually wrote a tribute to McPherson at the time, even though they were on opposing sides. Colonel Newbald was only 27 at the time of passing. A captain, later promoted to lieutenant colonel, he was killed in April of 1864 at the Battle of Pleasant Hill. Buried on the battlefield at the time, they later erected a monument in his honor in Hillsborough Cemetery in Iowa. Next up, we have several items pertaining to Abraham Lincoln, who was quite important during the Civil War. Here is a plaster statue representing him signing the Emancipation Proclamation, a campaign ribbon from 1860, a certificate of donation toward his statue that currently sits outside our state capitol, as well as a copy of the newspaper that came out the morning following his assassination. The Spanish-American War took place in 1898 and was the first war that the U.S. fought overseas. Admiral Dewey and his men decimated the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay, and later, ground troops drove out the Spaniards to help get the Philippines their independence. Unfortunately, certain Americans thought that there were too many American interests in play in the Philippines, and instead decided to annex them. This led to hard feelings by the Filipinos, and they began to push back. Several threats were made, and in one such scuffle, a shot was fired, and thus began the Philippine-American War. It just so happens that the man who fired that shot, William Grayson, was a member of the 1st Nebraska Infantry. Grayson was an immigrant from England who settled in Beatrice and enlisted in the U.S. Army in May of 1898. Here is a photo we have of Grayson standing next to Outpost 2, where the fight broke out on February 4th, 1899. This photo is from an album donated by a member of Company A, 1st Nebraska. We are lucky enough to have not one, but 2 photo albums from this era. The other comes from a member of the 51st Iowa. Both were taken to a print shop where they enlarged the photos. Many that were printed are available in this poster display, while others were printed on canvas. In these photos, you can see the men training, going off to war via ship, and then a few from their time in the Philippines. In this area, you'll also see a diary and a uniform coat belonging to men from Company A, 1st Nebraska, as well as a shield from the Moro tribe donated by Orlando Gray Palmer. Orlando was a Rough Rider, serving with Teddy Roosevelt, and he's also our founder's second husband. Palmer ran away from his family farm in Iowa at the age of 10. He hitched rides to Florida, where he heard they were recruiting for the Army. The officers were so impressed that one of them made him his drummer boy. In 1898, Palmer joined Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, where he became first sergeant for Troop D of the 1st U.S. Cavalry, serving in both Cuba and the Philippines. Because of this, we have several items belonging to him, including 2 letters signed by Teddy Roosevelt, his signed Rough Rider papers, and several invitations and other tokens he had collected over time. Later, during World War I, he was promoted to major and was put in charge of the 320th Machine Gun Battalion of the 82nd Division. This unit was made up of 105 officers and 3,000 enlisted men. Here are a few items belonging to him from that time period. Some of them are a burlap-covered helmet, correspondence, belts, training manuals, cavalry boots, and feed bags. Palmer retired from active duty with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel of the Cavalry on January 6, 1925. He married Anna Bemis in 1944, and they stayed married until his death in 1950. Also in our World War I section, you'll see another presidential signature, this one from Lyndon B. Johnson, on a certificate belonging to Grover Arringdale. Next to this, you'll also see his enlistment and discharge papers. Other World War I items include information on John J. Pershing, this hat and scrapbook belonging to George Holdeman, another soldier who served in the Spanish-American War, and a collection of helmets, both American and not, as well as several uniforms belonging to USA soldiers. This full uniform and jacket belonging to Richard A. Nolan. Notice the extra accessories such as the homemade hats, vest, hand covers, and the added leg wrappings. One thing to remember is that these men were outdoors in any and all weather, so you did what you could to keep warm. Other uniforms representing the Army, Air Force, and Home Guard can also be seen in this area, as well as other World War I artifacts, such as a gas mask, swords, grenade, and this canteen carved with the name of each city in which the soldier was stationed. Moving on, you'll see 2 different footlockers from World War I. The green case belonged to A.P. Dahl from his time at Kelly Airfield in Texas. Above the case is a bundle of his personal items, as well as several photos of A.P. This wooden footlocker belonged to Joseph Atmatter McCarthy. If you look closely, you'll see his name spelled out in nails on the top, and USA spelled out on the front. If you are to open it up, you'll see photos frozen in time from World War I. Originally coming to Nebraska on the orphan train, he was taken in by a German-speaking couple. He didn't speak German, so a local pastor reached out to the McCarthy family and asked them to house him until he could be sent back to the train. The McCarthys housed him for years, living as he would leave any day, but he ended up staying with them until he left to serve in World War I. When he passed away from pneumonia in Belfast after his ship went through a rough storm, the government wasn't sure what to do with his $10,000 life insurance policy. At the time, a congressman stepped in and determined it would go to the McCarthy family, even though they had never formally adopted him. The McCarthys were heavily in debt and would have lost their farm if not for this money. In the end, the McCarthys saved Joe from a life of loneliness, and in return, he saved them when this money saved their farm. This Fighting Symbols newspaper article is neat as it features pictures of all the symbols to represent the different divisions. Check out this framed photo. From far away, it looks like trees on a hill, but upon closer inspection, it's actually several soldiers instead, grouped together to watch a rodeo on Christmas Day. Around this corner, you'll see our women in the military section. On the left are 2 uniforms from a Red Cross worker during World War I. These are from Paris and an Armenian refugee camp in Beirut, and belong to Jean Holdeman, wife of George Holdeman, owner of the scrapbook from earlier. We also have several World War II artifacts relating to women serving, like these photos of ordnance plants outside Ord and Omaha. See, there were many rules on safety and keeping clean. One such photo shows the women washing their hands. The chemical in the water would turn red when coming into contact with TNT, so you could tell your hands were officially cleaned once the red was all washed away. These photos were so popular that they made it all the way into a newspaper article in Akron, Ohio. Moving on, you'll see several posters regarding women's roles in World War II, and 4 separate uniforms. From left to right, you'll see Army, Navy, Marines, and Red Cross. This Army uniform is from the Women's Army Corps, or WAC, and belonged to Bernadine Burnham Johnston. It also includes a souvenir hat. The Navy uniform is from the Health Services Division and was worn by Frances Wiswell, also including a hat. The Marine Corps uniform was worn by Hazel Nichols, a projectionist at Camp Pendleton. And the Red Cross uniform is actually from the Gray Ladies and was worn at the Fairmont Air Base, here in Nebraska, by Frances Stover. The Gray Ladies mostly help with things like writing letters and doing arts and crafts to keep your mind healthy. In the corner, you'll see a flag and poster representing the United Nations, which was created during World War II. Moving on, you'll see several war bond posters. These were quite common to see around town, as war bonds bought things like weapons, vehicles, medicine, and food, and the U.S. wanted their soldiers to have the best of the best. Also included in this display is a poster about the Sullivan brothers. All 5 brothers died within hours of each other when the ship that they were on was torpedoed and sunk. There are also Norman Rockwell posters, again selling war bonds. Next up, we have several World War II uniforms, ranging from the Army, to the Navy, to the Marines. Take a closer look, as some have ribbons and medals. One such uniform belonged to Hub Foster. Hub served in Louisiana, as well as on the East Coast and other locations stateside. Upon his return from service, he became the owner of Foster Dry Cleaners. Later, he worked at the York News-Times and started the York Seniors Fun Club. He also announced for many local sports teams. Hub passed away in 2013 and is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in York, Nebraska. Next to Hub's is a uniform belonging to George Zavodny. Along with his uniform are photos of the ships George served on, as well as 2 separate photo albums. One is filled with photos he took during his time in the service, and the other is filled with photos of his shipmates. Several have personalized messages written on them. This glass case is full of World War II memorabilia, such as sniff kits, playing cards, mess kits, shells, bayonets, dog tags, and more medals. On top you'll see books, ration items, helmets, items belonging to Bud Stanton next to his Marines uniform, plus photos of Art Felt to go with his uniform and discharge papers. Moving on to our 134th area, the 134th Volunteer Infantry was part of the Nebraska National Guard. Several photos are labeled as the York Boys, and here you'll see photos of this division ranging from the 1920s through the 1940s. There is also a uniform belonging to Glenn Fenning, a member of the 134th, as well as a table full of rosters, newsletters, a diary documenting things like places traveled, and a pennant and flag that were carried in a 1994 ceremony in Normandy. The 134th did serve during the initial battle in Normandy, so these items were carried during a commemoration. The last war featured in this exhibit is the Korean War. This area is made up of mostly uniforms, including some from the Air Force, Marines, and Army. This Air Force uniform belonged to Airman First Class Francis Edward Moran. Moran was killed in a non-hostile crash on June 18, 1953. As a member of the 51st Medical Group, he was on his way back to Korea from R&R in Japan. After an engine failed, the plane crashed into a field. It was carrying 129 people, and there were no survivors. The crash was labeled as the world's worst disaster in the history of aviation at that time. These Marine Corps uniforms belonged to Joseph Roddy McCarthy, nephew to Joseph Atmatter McCarthy. Roddy was a staff sergeant who served from 1951 to 1954. After the war, he worked for the U.S. Postal Service and farmed. This Army uniform belonged to Darrell Henderson. He served in the U.S. Army from 1953 to 1955. After the war, Darrell was an exalted ruler of the Elks and held various Grand Lodge appointments. Along with these uniforms is a roll of honor, listing the names of those who died during their time in the service. This was donated by the American Legion in 1988 and shows names from several wars. And lastly, here is our firearms collection. These items span from the Civil War to World War II and have various donors. Each rifle on the left is from the Civil War. Notice the top rifle with the wire wrapped around it? If this was broken during training, he would have gotten a replacement. The fact that it was wrapped up probably means it happened on the battlefield and he needed to fix it so he could keep fighting. These would often break when being rammed into something, such as a door or another soldier. On the right, you'll see 4 rifles from the Spanish-American War, including 3 Springfield rifles and 1 Krag Jorgensen. And below those, you'll see 2 from World War II. The one on the top is actually Japanese, and if you look closely, you'll see characters on the top of it, as well as a mark where the Imperial seal was ground off, either by a Japanese fighter before it fell into the wrong hands, or the American who took it. The weapon below it is Polish, and not many exist because many were destroyed in favor of using American-made weapons instead.
That concludes our tour of our America at War exhibit. For more information, visit our website, palmermuseum.com.